Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're doing very well today. And even though I've already covered some of the most relevant to our interest cards from Zendikar Rising, our interest being the BGX family, the Midrange family, and Modern, there are still more cards to talk about. And this batch of cards is going to be a little bit harder to rate overall due to the nature of the design space that the design team is exploiting here. There's some stuff that I think there's every chance that people are sleeping on, including myself. So we do need to take a real theoretical look at what's going on here with some of these other will they rock cards, will they rock candidates, if you will. And of course, testing will be warranted, extensive testing if we can manage it. But until such time as these cards are legal and we can really test them in a competitive way, I guess all we can do is take a look at them, apply the theory that has served us so well in the past. So let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here, for watching. Thank you even more to the patrons who do make this content possible. And let's talk about some Will They Rock candidates, beginning right here with Inscription of Ruin. Inscription of Ruin is a 3-mana black sorcery, 2 generic, 1 black, with a kicker cost of 2 generic, 2 black. So to kick it is a total of 7 mana, and the kicker is essentially flavor text on this card for reasons I'll get into at the end of this little segment. But to begin, let's just conceive of it without the kicker cost as a pure modal spell. So it says for 3 mana you get to choose 1. Again, if the spell is kicked, you choose any number, but for purposes of evaluation, 3 mana, choose 1. First option, target opponent discards 2 cards. That is Mind Rot. And Mind Rot is not especially modern playable, but the reason Mind Rot is not modern playable is because it is dead if the opponent has already emptied their hand, and some decks just empty the hand too fast for Mind Rot to ever realistically be useful against them, and other decks, even if they don't naturally empty the hand out, due to the nature of the attrition that most Mind Rot decks will be playing, and the nature of just games sprawling out into turn 7, turn 10, what have you, and then you top deck the Mind Rot right after your opponent has finally played their last land, played their last spell. That is why the card Mind Rot is not good enough. But if Mind Rot happened to come with 2 other use cases, both of which happen to be good in most circumstances where the Mind Rot mode is mad, then the Mind Rot mode is bad, rather, then the Mind Rot effect is actually pretty interesting because it is just a 2-for-1, and we are trying to work on the hand arguably more than any other form of interaction with BGX midrange. So yeah, the first mode is Mind Rot, and the second mode is a very bad unearth. Return target creature card with CMC 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's 3 mana instead of 1 to cast it. It only gets CMC 2 or less instead of a ceiling of 3 or less, and you cannot cycle it away if you don't want to do such a thing. But hey, this is the price we pay for modal flexibility, right? And the final mode is destroy target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less. Smother is the best comparison with this. It is a bad smother. You could also compare it to Abrupt Decay, but frankly, it's not even in the same realm of existence as Abrupt Decay. Abrupt Decay just has so many more relevant upsides than this. So why are we looking at this if all the modes are so bad? Arguably the highest ceiling mode in a vacuum is Mind Rot mode, the first mode. Target opponent discards 2 cards. Well, maybe I'm overrating it. Maybe we shouldn't even be analyzing it and we should just say, well, this card sucks, next. But you know what? I really think people might be sleeping on this one a little bit, and it's simply because each mode is so incredibly relevant to our interests. The classic wrong half of the deck problem is what afflicts BGX more than anything. What I mean by that is that we are a deck that needs our interaction to line up with what the opponent is doing. So if you Inquisition a big mana hand on like turn 3 and they have all 4+ drops in hand, that's a wrong half of the deck moment. If you draw Fatal Push against a resolved like Karn Liberated, that's a wrong half of the deck moment. If you draw your Lightning Bolt and you're staring down a Gurmag Angler, that's a wrong half of the deck moment. But with Inscription of Ruin and with modal spells in general, we mitigate naturally the wrong half of the deck problem if each mode is realistically relevant. And if you consider any common scenario, okay, maybe the opponent has a Leyline of Sanctity down and a Rest in Peace down, so you can't Mind Rot them, you can't Unearth, and they're also like a Pillow Fort deck, so they have no creatures to destroy. Oh, yes, we can come up with scenarios where Inscription of Ruin is totally dead, but realistically speaking, on like any given turn, against any of the decks in Modern that you have a realistic chance of encountering, we either want to attack the hand with a Mind Rot style effect. We either want to grind by buying back a relevant creature, the one that is hardest to handle out of all the ones they've removed, or, of course, we need to do the classic BGX thing of kill their creature. And guys, Inscription of Ruin really does do all three. So this is a card where each individual mode is kind of not that powerful. And it's also a card with a relatively low ceiling because the only X for 1 potential it has is the Mind Rot mode. In theory, yes, we can kick it, but number one, getting to 7 mana is just so unrealistic for our deck, it's not even funny. And then number two, even if we do get to 7 mana, we're not going to have all three modes be relevant. Like, if we have resolved a 7 mana Inscription of Ruin, the opponent doesn't have cards in hand. That's just like pretty much how it's going to be. In all but the strangest of circumstances. Maybe you could kick it and you can buy something back and destroy one of their things in a mid-range mirror, that could be good. But realistically, we are just looking at the 3 mana modal spell. And I don't know, guys, I really want to like it. Now, maybe a part of why I want to like it is because it's so cool. Inscription of Ruin, love it. Love the full art. Absolutely love the art, even irrespective of the borderless style here. And maybe part of it is because they call back pretty strongly to me to the very wild Glyph of cycle from Legends. Look at these crazy old Legends cards. Glyphs of Delusion. We're targeting walls with all of these glyphs. Glyph of Doom, very, very black. We love that. Very simple, turning the wall into a Doomblade. For the turn, Glyph of Life, obviously white gets stuck with a poor life gain effect, but Glyph of Destruction is wild, giving a wall +10/+0. Glyph of Reincarnation is easily the craziest one of these 5, if you ask me. So that's a bit of a tangent, but the point is Inscription of Ruin's really cool. Reminds me of the Glyph cycle, and I do wonder if it is good enough to rock. I think this card merits testing because, again, all 3 modes are so relevant. They're more relevant, frankly, than the modes of Collective Brutality, at least if we're looking at main deck on average. Now, I'm not saying this is as strong as Brutality because a big strength of Brutality is it allows us for once to be tempo positive by escalating aggressively and turning bad cards in hand into escalations for Brutality is another way to solve the wrong half of the deck problem. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Inscription is as strong, nor is it as strong of a hate card as Brutality, but Brutality has been almost relegated to a sideboard hate piece these days for us, and I do wonder if Inscription of Ruin is like a main deckable one of. Again, maybe I'm overrating it, maybe I want to like it too much. You let me know what you think. And next up, we've got to talk about the green Inscription of Abundance, partially because they should be compared, they're part of the same cycle, and they're in our 2 core colors on BGX, and partially because people have been asking me directly about both cards. Now, my conclusion for Inscription of Ruin, again, is that it is super flexible, but has a pretty low power ceiling and also a very low kind of efficiency factor, right? Each individual mode is relatively underpowered, besides maybe the Mind Rot mode. Inscription of Abundance I kind of see as the inverse of all of that. So Inscription of Abundance has a pretty high efficiency factor. It also has a really high ceiling. So let's look at those things. Let's look at the pluses. It is only 2 mana to cast it as a modal spell instead of 3. It is an instant instead of a sorcery, and the kicker is 3. So we have a total of 5 mana for a fully kicked Inscription of Abundance, which is far more realistic than the 7 required for Inscription of Ruin. Finally, unlike Inscription of Ruin, you can realistically get all 3 modes to be live at the same time by the mid to late game when it's realistic to cast it for the kicker cost. So, all of that said, Inscription of Abundance sounds like a more powerful card than Inscription of Ruin when I put it that way, and it is. I would say that it is. This is just a more powerful card. It's got a higher ceiling, it's more efficient, and it's more realistic to get a massive X for 1 in your favor. However, having said all of that, I actually think Inscription of Abundance is likely to be worse for us in BGX than Inscription of Ruin. It is less likely to carve out a realistic slot in an optimized list, and it's for one simple reason that it is so much more conditional. The 3 modes on Inscription of Abundance are as follows. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Second mode, target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control. Third mode, target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Do you notice a theme here, my friends? The theme is that we need a creature in play to do absolutely anything good with this card. You know, there are corner cases. We could make the shadow player gain life, which is actually pretty cool. And so maybe I'll put a caveat in here that if you want to get mega spicy with your anti-shadow tech and also have this in mind for other matchups, maybe that could be a justification for testing this card. But if we're looking at the most realistic across-the-board use cases for this, we're trying to, like, grow our creatures. We're trying to gain a bunch of life off of a Tarmogoyf. We're trying to, again, use Tarmogoyf probably to fight an opposing creature and get a big X for 1 in our favor. Here's the big problem. If we are sticking a Tarmogoyf, for example, let's look at the second mode, where life gain is what loses us or wins us the game. Well, you know what? The games where we have a Tarmogoyf sticking around are the ones we're winning anyway, against Burn and Prowess, and against some of the more all-in aggro decks, right? Like, turn 1 Pusher Inquisition into turn 2 Tarmogoyf is the best thing you can do against those decks already. So I would rather play other life gain effects that are far less conditional, that gives us a chance to interact with the opponent or to roll back a lot of what they've done without already having a Goyf in play or another fatty in play. In other words, I consider that life gain mode to be very much win more. And fighting effects, target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, that is the very definition of win more. We are BGX. We have access to black removal by definition, and then sometimes red, sometimes white, depending on what variant we're playing. We don't need to lean into fight effects at all. Fight effects see no play in Modern, and that's for a very good reason. They are too conditional. And again, we have to give credit here. This is a modal spell, so if the fight mode is not live, then maybe other modes would be live. But again, the problem here is they are all contingent upon the same thing, upon having a creature. And then finally, 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Again, that's fine, and I say finally, but it's actually first on the card, so it's worth noting that if this all resolves and you're kicking it, first the counters will go on, and then you'll gain more life, including from the counters, you know, the extra 2 life, and then your creature will be bigger to fight opposing creatures. So when it lines up, the ceiling is enormous, but +2/+2 basically to a creature permanently, that's a fine floor if nothing else is relevant, but that's not really worth a card. And again, the big problem is that if we don't have a creature, it is totally dead, so it is the exact opposite of Inscription of Ruin, and despite being a more efficient card, despite being a more powerful card when simply cast, like in a vacuum, and despite being far more realistic to kick, and having a higher ceiling when kicked, I actually still think Inscription of Abundance will not rock, whereas Inscription of Ruin I am interested to test. And next up, it is Lithoform Blight. This is a good card. It's gotten like no hype because Cleansing Wildfire is far better, but not every BGX deck is Jund. And for the rockers out there, for the Abzan players, for the Sultai mid-range players, Lithoform Blight is actually a card we should be considering. It's a 2-mana black enchantment, 1 generic, 1 black, enchant land. When Lithoform Blight enters the battlefield, draw a card. So if you haven't seen my Cleansing Wildfire video, and you don't understand why this could be good, please go watch that. This card is weaker overall than Cleansing Wildfire, not strictly worse, but definitely worse overall, and a big part of why this and Wildfire are both very interesting, very playable to me, is because they cantrip, because they draw a card. So again, if you need further explication, please go see that video. But Lithoform Blight says, after it ETBs and draws a card, enchanted land loses all land types and abilities, and has tap to add colorless, and tap, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color. So this is mostly worse than Cleansing Wildfire, and again, I compared in the Cleansing Wildfire video the card itself to Spreading Seas, and Lithoform Blight is very similar structurally to Spreading Seas, and all of the downfalls of that relative to the upsides of Cleansing Wildfire I did explain at length in that video. But a couple things for our purposes here, if they destroy it, and we are on a BGX Lurrus build, we can in theory buy it back with Lurrus, and that's definitely really nice. If it does happen to go to the graveyard for one reason or another, it is an enchantment, and that can be really nice for growing the Goyf. But these are all kind of not that realistic, or if they are realistic, they're just kind of silver linings in the cloud, right? The point is, this is a land hate piece that is value positive because it replaces itself, but it is just not as effective as Cleansing Wildfire. So I don't think you should reach for this card if you're on Jund and if you have access to Wildfire. But I actually, for the Lurrus builds that are floating around right now, I actually do think I might like this better than Damping Sphere. I am a notorious not an opponent of Damping Sphere, but I'm very low on the card. I'm much lower on Damping Sphere than the average BGX player for sure. I just don't think static hate pieces are good fits in our deck. Like, structurally speaking, especially when they're 2-drops, it opens us up that much more to Blast Zone. It clunks up our progression that much more. And I also don't like turning on Nature's Claim, for example, out of the Tron players. And Lithoform Blight has some of the same issues. It's a 2-drop, so it's clunking up our progression. It's going to turn on Nature's Claim, and it even allows them to make rainbow mana off of Blight. So whatever claim effect they have, they're going to be able to cast at the low cost of 1 life to unlock Tron or whatever it's going to be, and all the rest, and, vulnerable to Blast Zone alongside Goyfs and Bobs. However, I still think this is better than Damping Sphere, mostly because it draws a card, and that's a very, very good thing. Now, it does, unfortunately, it is still black, it's still vulnerable to Veil of Summer, so we've got to remember that. Nevertheless, this is kind of like a low-key, really interesting printing for Rock, and for Abzan, and for Sultai. So we'll see exactly how the big mana decks adjust to the presence of Cleansing Wildfire. We'll see what the meta calls for, but I am going to probably try this out in the place of what might otherwise be Damping Sphere or Fulminator Mage for at least a league or two. We'll see how it goes, but this is one I'm interested to hear your thoughts on as well. Next up, we've got to talk about Soul Shatter. This is one that I think it's important to note that it exists, because Edict effects are always very interesting for our deck. Our deck is structured in such a way that if we cannot remove the opponent's creatures, we are in big trouble, and sometimes an Edict effect can be supplementary removal and just play fine along with our targeted removal. Other times, it's the only thing that we have that can hit what the opponent's doing. Notoriously, Bogles is the big culprit here, but there are other ones as well. Hexproof, Indestructible, stuff like this. And Soul Shatter is an Edict effect, and it's one that is not stopped by Leyline of Sanctity, because it says each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So it has a few upsides relative to other options. Number one, being able to hit a planeswalker with this, especially their best one, is actually really good. So, this is a realistic card that you could play against blue-white control, for example. It's a way at instant speed to take care of 5 mana Teferi, Jace the Mind Sculptor before they can untap and protect them, where otherwise we might not be able to. That's definitely a fine use case, I think. And the other thing that's really nice about it is specifically against Bogles, it is a way to edict the Bogle. And probably make sure you're going to edict it. At least it allows you to play around them protecting it with a second Bogle that is naked, not suited up, or with an untapped fetch land to go get Dryad Arbor. In this case, a second Bogle could still protect this, right? Because they'll have the same converted mana cost. They could also protect it with Core Spirit Dancer, but I guess the point is you couldn't protect it with Dryad Arbor, right? And that is pretty big game. However, it is still suffering from the 3 mana 1-for-1 it's kind of hamstrung by that. I am so cool playing 1 mana 1-for-1s in Modern. I'm pretty cool playing 2 mana 1-for-1s, but 3 mana 1-for-1s are always a little bit hard to justify. So make no mistake, despite its many upsides and despite the many powerful use cases of this card, I do think it is going to be a little bit more fringe simply because it does not have that X-for-1 potential. Unlike something like Liliana's Triumph. Remember, this card exists, it sees relatively little play, and it's a 2 mana Edict effect that also gets around Leyline and also has 2-for-1 potential if you control Liliana Planeswalker, which admittedly is not that common to have all this stuff lined up. Usually you'll play the Triumph first, of course, but it can come up. So, of course, I think overall probably a worse card than Liliana's Triumph, probably one that and the latter not really seeing much play right now anyway, but the fact that it does hit Planeswalkers, this is emblematic of a kind of sub-theme in the set where they are printing things that are kind of creature or planeswalker removal. And between this and between Blood Chief's Thirst and maybe another option or two yet to come, we have to remember that these cards exist, because especially on non-Jund BGX decks, we can really struggle to answer planeswalkers efficiently. And Soul Shatter is a card that might fit into your maybe board for just that purpose. Next up, we have Nighthawk Scavenger. This is a juiced-up Vampire Nighthawk. It is identical, besides the power stat. And the power, instead of 2 from Vampire Nighthawk, is Nighthawk Scavenger's power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyard. So a slightly lower floor, a much higher ceiling. Nevertheless, this card will not rock. I've had a lot of people ask me about it. Nope, it's just not going to rock. It's just not going to do it. It's not where we want to be. If we could trade away something here for haste, then I'd be interested, because then we're looking at a lifelinker with haste and with Death Touch, making blocking potentially problematic, and a very high power ceiling, right? So we've got all kinds of good upsides. It is a realistic way to swing the life totals in your favor when you're racing against an aggro deck. But because it doesn't have haste, we're basically hoping to slam it and hoping that it survives long enough to ward off attackers and maybe to start attacking itself. It's just not realistic at 3 mana with toughness 3. If it had haste, I could live with toughness 3. If it had toughness 4, I could live without haste. The fact that it does not have either means that as much as I'm a vampire respecter, that I love this card, I think it's so cool. I wish Modern was in a place where we could play cards like this and it would be good enough, but I do not think it is. Maybe in Pioneer. Not in Modern, not gonna rock. And finally, my friends, we have to look at a couple. What are they called? Modal double-faced cards, I think? Something like that. Bala Recovery is the first one, and this is what I'm talking about when I say that this is the type of design that is really hard to rate. Don't be surprised if these do nothing in Modern, like any of these. Don't be surprised if they're way more widespread than people are predicting. At least that's my take. Maybe I just have kind of a blind spot for my ability to analyze this newfangled design with real confidence, but basically I'm taking an agnostic stance on these types of cards, but I do want to point out a couple interesting ones. As mentioned, Bala Recovery, sorcery, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a bad regrowth, and regrowth, remember, was printed into Modern Horizons 1, so that is a Modern legal card that does not see play. Another way to look at this is a bad Eternal Witness. It's an Ewit that doesn't leave a 2/1 body behind, which is really important. Ewit is fringe playable. Technically, regrowth could be fringe playable, but nobody really does in the BGX archetype. But this is Modal. It is a land. an ETB tapped land, but a land nevertheless. And again, I find it baffling to rate this card. I just think that people who are claiming with certainty exactly how these cards are going to play out across all formats, I think these cards more than any other card, their exact power level will become clear only with widespread testing and with iterating with them in a variety of shells. You know, how, like, let's say for the sake of testing, we wanted to play this as a 4 of. I don't think that would ever be correct, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, you know, how many lands would we replace versus how many spells would we replace? It's going to take people a while to figure out stuff like this. Assuming that these cards land on the stronger side of that spectrum that I just outlined, this one could be interesting. Somebody pointed out in YouTube comments that I was looking for some way to buy back equipment with the Abzan Gooseblade League that I played recently, and of course Eternal Witness might be best in class for that, but this card is actually really interesting in such a role in such a deck too. So Bala Ged Sanctuary, Modal with Bala Ged Recovery, what do you think about those? Very, very interesting if you ask me. And the other modal land/spell hybrid I wish to look at is translated, but is apparently called something like Hagra's Bite, which on the spell side is an instant, which is a murder, a 3 mana, 1 generic double black, destroy target creature if the opponent controls no basic land. But if they do control basic land, it's going to cost you 4. It's going to cost you an extra generic mana, and the other side is going to look like this. I don't know what it's called, but it maybe, was it Hagra Pit? Something like that. In any case, it's an ETB tapped black land. So I'm actually slightly less interested in this than I am in Bala Ged Recovery, and I don't know why. Again, I find it very hard to rate these cards with confidence. Maybe it's because we have 1,000,001 kill spells that are all hyper-efficient, best in class in the format, and whereas our regrowth style effects that could be interesting if they're modal with a land are certainly far more lacking. I have no idea, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's more correct to rate this one more highly, because it is, after all, a kill spell or a land, depending on how you wish to use it. So I just want to bring these to your attention, guys. I want to kind of harvest your takes here. I want to hear all of your thoughts, your arguments for them, because I don't know if I should be testing these cards or not. I'm going to be perfectly honest, but they are very, very intriguing, if nothing else. Okay, friends, so there you have it. Some more spoilers from Zendikar Rising. This was longer than I intended to make it. I kind of wanted to make this a quick and dirty rundown, if you will, but I guess there's just always more to talk about, right? There's always more nuance to find, or maybe there's always just more babbling for the Grimflayer to do that is in excess of what's necessary. I don't know, but I hope you liked it anyway. We are definitely going deep on some of the spoilers, and something about this set is compelling me to do so. With a lot of the previous sets, I was just like, nah, that's not gonna rock. Maybe I'll cover it if enough people ask me, but nah, not interested. Here, it's got me wondering. A lot of these cards, they've got me wondering, and maybe it's because I'm more interested in the set thematically. I don't know. I'm trying to remain objective, but that's why I'm interested to hear what you have to say as well. So nobody can deny this is a pretty wild, very, very successful set so far in at least a lot of different ways. We'll see how it ends up impacting Modern, but definitely has got me more hyped than I've been for a new set in a while, and as I mentioned in the other video, I'm even more hyped for what's to come. So let me know what you think, guys, and I hope you like this one. Thanks for watching. I will talk to you soon. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.